So I was watching Hank Green's latest YouTube video, Does the Press Hate YouTube? And he said something in that video that really resonated with me and I thought was true, which was that when he was writing for EcoGeek many years ago, he never thought about whether a story was good or bad, merely that it was interesting, particularly interesting to his readers. And what makes a story interesting is often because you don't know very much about a subject, whether it be the reporter or the journalist or the writer or the audience, the thing that will make the subject interesting usually has to be quite large. It either has to be life-threatening or groundbreaking or cultural shifting. And because the MO is always whether something is interesting and not whether something is good or bad, when it hits that threshold of like, oh, this might be something interesting, the nature of the press and media is that no journalist is an expert on every subject. They just can't be, because that's the nature of their job, is to not be an expert on every subject. So what they do, if you're a good journalist, or you're trained to be a good journalist, is you look for experts on the subject to comment on the story that seems to be interesting in the reporter's mind, or that they think the audience will find interesting. So they reach out to an expert or an authority on whatever subject they're writing a story about. But the way they choose these authorities and these experts often isn't based in any grounding or knowledge about whether they are indeed an expert or an authority on the subject they're talking about. They choose it more based on the person seems authoritative, or a lot of people listen to this individual. And because the journalist and the reporter doesn't most likely know very much about the subject they're reporting on, it's a chicken and an egg situation. Because they don't know the subject very well, they're dependent on an expert to qualify and get a statement from. But they also can't judge whether the authority figure they're using to prop up their story is indeed the right authority figure to be using. If we take the example of YouTube, the problem is often that journalists don't know anything about YouTube. I can tell you this by working in many newsrooms in New York City. They don't really watch YouTube. They don't understand YouTube. It's too new of a platform. And the way they were educated in school wasn't around digital media. It was around, if you go to broadcasting, it's television, or if you print, it's, newspapers. And so an entirely new distribution platform, on top of the fact that entirely new types of content are being made on this distribution platform, most journalists just don't know what to make of it. And which is why you get the stories about Logan Paul or PewDiePie, etc. And no journalist really is thinking, well, is this story a good story or a bad story? Is it a good story about the subject, Logan Paul? Is it a good story about, the background upon which Logan Paul exists on, YouTube? They just think, is this story interesting? And because that's the guiding principle, you often get stories that seem very biased to somebody who's knowledgeable about the subject. And that bias is inherent in anything you're ignorant of. Right? Anytime any individual, you or I, talk about something we don't know very much about, there's going to be inherent bias in that subject, just because we're not knowledgeable on it. In some ways, it's a Dunning-Kruger effect of information, not just skill. If you're not familiar with Dunning-Kruger effect, Wikipedia, basically, it's when somebody who is incompetent or not very good at a skill highly overestimates their ability to do so at the beginning, and then as they become more competent, they then start undervaluing or underestimating their competency in it, because they become aware of how complex the task or situation is. So what you have often is a Dunning-Kruger effect of information in journalists, because a story must reach a threshold of interesting, not whether it's good or bad, and because it must be interesting, in order for it to be interesting to a relatively uninformed audience, an uninformed journalist. It must be, somewhat of a large topic or a large moment that then forces the journalist to seek an expert witness or an authority figure to, try to comment on the story. But they don't know how to suss out anything. Where does this all go back to? This all has to go back to YouTube, which is, I think, actually Hank Green is correct, and that you shouldn't attribute to malice what you can contribute to incompetence. And ultimately, because YouTube is a new platform that most people do not understand, that journalists do not interact with very often, it gets covered poorly because of their ignorance about it, and within that ignorance there is inherent bias. But it's not malice in the sense of like ooh, we're threatened by YouTube, or advertisers, you know, we want the advertisers over or going to us over YouTube. It's none of that. It simply comes back to the root question of, is this story interesting? Not whether is this story good or bad. Anyway, that's just a thought for you guys today. If you want to watch another video, you can click around. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thank you.